Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, and that was it was an awesome talk. I think it's a really exciting time to be building overall in MCP. I don't think I've fell in love with the technology like I have with MCP, just because the possibilities are really endless. Um, and that kind of takes me into like what I'll be talking about today. So this is a problem that I faced myself. I started out with MCP by building a gateway. I then built a server, started working on a client, and one of the biggest issues I ran into was tool call selection. So, what happens when you load in a ton of tools, and how do you ensure that the right tool is being called? I'm sure, as many people know, like the more tools you're running, the worse the results generally are, and that's because of how much you're stuffing into the context window. And so, say for example, you're using Claude to run your MCP servers. The system prompt alone in Claude is 24,000 tokens. So that's already eating up a giant portion of the context window. Um, I then went ahead and I pulled like about 8,000 MCP servers from Glamma, and I calculated the token length of all of the tools. And on average, each tool call or each tool description was about 30 tokens. And so we're kind of this interesting dilemma where if you want to improve tool call selection, you need to basically have more comprehensive tool descriptions. Yet on the other hand, like the more in-depth your tool descriptions are, the more tools you're loading, um, the worst the worse tool call selection is, and the more issues you're going to run into with the context window. Um, and so, in order to test this, I wanted to set up an experiment. Like, what happens when you load in a bunch of tools? Where does the breaking point seem to be when you're creating a server with a bunch of tools? Um, And so what I set up was basically two servers, one with 60 tools and one with 5 tools. I then created like an evals client to essentially, or an evals package, it's up on GitHub, to basically initialize a client, um, load the MCP servers, and then programmatically go through a list of prompts, um, and then afterwards grade which tool was chosen and if it's like the correct tool. So yeah, setting up the client pretty straightforward, basically just using the AI SDK from Vercel, create the transport, servers were over STDIO, and then after that, just like uh, essentially loop through the prompts and sorry, looked like a chat distracting me. Loop through the prompts and call the corresponding tools. The prompt's pretty straightforward. Basically, your standard LLM as a judge. And what it does is it looks at the tool call that came back and grades it if the right tool was selected, basically returning like an integer. And so to get started, I wanted to show like what happens when the wrong, like how bad can it be, right? So this is an example of the wrong tool being selected on um, the MCP server with 60 tools. So the prompt was, I like Inception and Interstellar. What movies would you recommend? It came back with the book recommender when it should have chosen the movie recommendation tool. Um, Same thing. I would like to reserve a table for two from English to Italian or translate that. It chose the code translation when it should have chose the language converter. I don't know about everybody else, but I'd prefer if when I ask for something to be translated to English, it wasn't translated to like PHP or Python. Um, and interestingly enough, the smaller server shows the correct tool in both cases. And so, yeah, what does the data essentially look like? Um, the So like I said, with the eval prompt, I basically scored it on a scale of 0 to 10, looping through like a few hundred prompts. And the difference was about a score of 1. But what I think is more, or sorry, zero point 0.8. What I think is more interesting is that when it's wrong, it gets it really wrong. And it's going to be very noticeable to the end user, which I think is like our ultimate goal here. Like, how do we build agents and tools that are um, going to improve like the lives or the processes of the people we're building for? Um, and yeah, when it gets it wrong, it gets it very wrong. And this essentially like scales from here. So 60 tools, like it was about 1 in 10 would in 1 in 10 prompts, the wrong tool would be chosen. As you add more tools, that scales down to like, um, I believe it was at like a few hundred tools where at, 3 of 10, the wrong prompt is chosen. But again, on the small server, it's near 100% hit rate on the correct tool being chosen. And so I didn't want to spend too much on the problem because, yeah, we all know that if you load too many tools in the context window, you're going to run into issues, right? It's there's a little bit of like common sense there. When there's more choices, it's hard to make a choice. It could be, an MCP client, or it could be, I don't know, me at dinner. When I had too many choices, I make the wrong choice a lot of times as well. But if there's two, generally pick the right one. Um, and there's a bunch of like pretty interesting solutions from um, people who have basically had to solve this in the wild. And so I'm going to talk through a few of them. They're all companies that have launched pretty big MCP servers. They have a lot of like surface area to cover essentially. And so these are problems that they needed to solve themselves. And what else I think is interesting is that there's been a bunch of different approaches to solve this. The other interesting thing is that most of the solutions are coming from the server side and not the client side. But there's also a lot you could do on the client side. And I'll touch on that after. I just wanted to start with the server side because I think that's what most people are building right now. So Block has this awesome article that I recommend everybody go read called Tools Are Like Onions. And essentially what they've done is kind of created like 3 core tools to start. They have like a discovery tool, a planning tool, and an execution tool. And each of these informs the client or host like how to choose and um, then execute the correct tool. And so just to like show you the code so you get a better idea, they've got like the get service info tool. Basically, you pass in like the category of like the API you want to call. So like in this example, it's catalog and payments. And then it will return information about like what it can do, like what those can do. And the next step is to then like, based on what's returned, okay, now that we know that what's possible, what are like the parameters needed, what are the validation rules, like what should the response schema look like, or what will the response schema look like. Interestingly enough, there's a PR open on the spec right now to introduce um, tool response schema. So that should solve some of these issues. It's also why it's so exciting to be building an MCP right now, is because there's so many issues to be solved. And but I think like the use cases are so exciting. So um, even like the solutions that I'm talking about here today, like some of them are making their way into the spec, and others are still like works in progress. Yeah, and then the final step is pretty straightforward. It's basically, uh, okay, now that we've retrieved the information, or now that we've seen what tools are possible, retrieved information about like the metadata of those tools, let's go ahead and call the correct tool. Um, Yeah, and so that's like the first approach is basically this layered approach to tool call selection and execution. Um, Next up is Apify, who I thought had a pretty interesting approach because they have, I want to say it's like 4,000 tools, which basically correspond to like the Apify actors, which are kind of like their, uh, it's like an internal, they're essentially like an API platform where like users can deploy APIs. And so each one of those is a corresponding MCP tool. And how they've decided to handle it is via the tool list change notification. And this is something that I will forewarn everybody, not many clients support yet, but it makes it so that you can dynamically add tools from your server. So, for example, like say you're running an MCP client and you want to use the Apify MCP server, you're building out like a bunch of, I don't know, automation tools. And your user types in, I want to scrape LinkedIn, or I want to scrape LinkedIn and then find those people on GitHub, right? So Apify is going to have scrapers for both of those. So what you can do is you can ping Apify through their Discover Actors tool and say, do you have any, you know, LinkedIn scrapers? They're going to respond back with the LinkedIn scraper. You can then call their add actor um, tool method, and that will then add that LinkedIn scraper to the MCP server. And so what you're basically able to do is dynamically find and add tools to the MCP server. So you don't have to like load all of these into context at once. Again, this isn't natively supported in like Claude or Cursor or a lot of clients, but if you are building your own host, sorry, it's supported natively by clients, but it's not natively supported by the host. So if you're building like your own host or like client architecture, uh, this is like a really interesting way to solve the problem. Because it again essentially like takes all of the complexity kind of like out of the equation. GitHub has another approach where they basically have like a CLI flag where you can toggle on and off the um, which sets of tools you want to use. So, for example, like you can pass in like the exact tool sets that you want to pull. Um, I'm not like as big of a fan of this approach just because it you're doing this like prior to your running the MCP server. Um, the other approach they've taken is with dynamic tool discovery. So that it's kind of works similar to Apify, where I encoded like the exact call and go they're using, but basically they're sending this tool list change notification and passing in all the tools. So again, similar approach to Apify. This is currently in beta with GitHub, but it allows you to kind of like dynamically register tools so that you're not overflowing the context window um, with your tools. And I think like if my hunch is that's kind of where we're going to take things. I think the tool list notification is a pretty good solution um, to this problem. But you know, what if you're building a host or a client? Like these have all been solutions kind of on the server side. But if you're like me, I'm trying to integrate with all I've been building a client that's trying to integrate with all of these publicly available MCP servers. That's one of the benefits of MCP is you get 4,000 integrations out of the box or however many MCP servers there are now. And um, you're not going to be able to take advantage of some of these cool things that GitHub and Block and other people are doing because the average person who's building a server isn't implementing these situations because they don't necessarily have to worry about it. And so you have some scenarios where, you know, Cursor, you can only add like 5 MCP servers. There's other hosts where clients where you have to like manually select the server you want, like you the user has to manually select it. And again, I don't think that's like a great scenario either. I think we should be dynamically determining which servers apply and then determining which tools apply. And I think that's like ultimately what's best for the user. And yeah, so how does this work? Or like, how could you implement something like this? So I'll take you through some like real kind of like scenarios I've run into, which is basically user types in a prompt like, I want to maybe pull all contributors to this GitHub repo, and then I want to find other GitHub repos they've contributed to, and then I want to pull those stars and then find the person on LinkedIn, right? So there's a bunch of like interconnected steps there. What I've found works best is basically you want to prompt to break this larger kind of like workflow into individual steps, and then essentially like try to figure out what servers and tools are going to be necessary for each individual step. That's what I found kind of as like the best um, essentially like results, like when I've run them through like evals or just like even looking at them myself. And the the way I've seen other people doing this is still like kind of pretty new, so there isn't like a ton of solution. Is basically to set up a vector store of all of your available tools. Um, so just like create the embeddings for all of your tools, prompt comes in, and then you're gonna want to do some type of like similarity search on the prompt and the tools, pull back the tools. Something to keep in mind is basically if you're using like all publicly available tools, like you need to embed the server description as well, because there might be a search GitHub tool and or just a search tool on the GitHub MCP server, and there might be a search tool on the YouTube MCP server, but they might not necessarily specify the upstream server name. So make sure you're passing that in alongside your tool call descriptions. And then the other thing you can do is like re-rank the tools upon retrieval. And I'll walk you through like some quick code examples on how to do this. So yeah, the essentially all you have to do is when the prompt comes in, create the embeddings and then do the similarity search on the embeddings, pull back the results, and then run them through like a re-ranker like BGE. This might even be overkill in a lot of cases, but if you really want to have the best results, this is the way to do it. Yeah, and so that's kind of like the quick overview of, I think, what people are doing to solve the tool call selection issue, which as as MCP scales, I think is going to be is one of the biggest things that needs to be solved, because I'm tired of Claude picking the wrong tool. I'm tired of, I don't like the MCP server limit caps that are in a lot of the clients or hosts. I think in order for this to really take off for people other than engineers, they don't need to know about MCP servers at all. We should be doing all of this on the back end, like without the end user having to toggle anything. They don't need to turn on this server. It should just pull the information for them. And same thing with agents. Like as we're building out agents, I think figuring out the correct tool for the agent to call is going to be vital. And with the explosion of MCP, we now have access to basically not any API on the internet, but most APIs are um, now able to be called or proxied through an MCP server in your agent. And so to really like scale this, I think that's one of the big things that needs to be solved is on like the tool call selection. Yeah, and so like what's kind of like next on the radar for like solutions here? I think there's a PR up in the spec for namespacing. There's a PR up in the spec for tool search, and there's been a lot of interesting back and forth there about whether tool search should be in the spec or not. For anybody curious, I'd really recommend reading it. There's a PR up about like pull request schema, And finally, there's one up about tracing and like OTel implementation. And yeah, that kind of takes me to the end of the talk. I guess like just to wrap things up, super excited about MCP, all the possibilities it offers. There's never been a better time to be building than right now.